Welcome to Kigali Global Dialogue. This is the live at Kigali studio recording session, going to discuss quite an interesting topic, crossing borders, countries and continents, the future of climate migration. My name is Rufus Karanja, and I work with the Embassy of Netherlands in Nairobi, Kenya, as a policy officer on displacement and durable solutions. And joining me is a distinguished panel together with me. To my immediate right is Professor Jenny Mander, who's a professor at Cambridge in the UK, and she is a co-director of the Center for Global Human Movement. Really a pleasure to have you here. And to my extreme right is Ms. Florencia Caro Sachetti, who is a senior program coordinator at CIPPEC in Argentina, which is a think tank in Argentina. Just to be able to start us off with framing the conversation and the discussion that we are having here, climate change is here with us, and it's threatening to displace millions of people, creating new migrant flows across and within countries' borders. And the trend of an increase and more frequent episodes of severe droughts and recurrent floods, as we have recently witnessed in this part of the world, in the Horn of Africa context, as well as wildfires. And just the other week, we saw quite a number of wildfires in Canada. We've seen them also in other parts of the world, and which is associated with the global warming, which is already creating a good evidence in terms of what climate change-related impacts are. And an emerging trend is that more of those displaced for climate reasons are crossing borders or being very much displaced within their countries. So with my panelists, both Professor Jenny and Florencia, and on this backdrop, we would like to do a short deep dive and reflection on this critical question: what is the future outlook of climate migration? Maybe I begin with you, Florencia. From the work that you do and the work that CIPPEC as a think tank in Argentina is doing, what does the present and the future of climate migration look like?
Thank you very much, Rufus. So human mobility has been, both across and within borders, has been a long-standing strategy to address economic, social, political risk, both for individuals and societies. So as these environmental threats escalate, we can expect to see an increase, and we are witnesses, actually, this increase in human mobility related to climate risks. So I think it's important to identify the fact that on the one hand, we have maybe environmental catastrophes that lead to forced displacement of people, but we also have climate change as an invisible driver of human mobility in many cases, because migrants rarely identify as environmental migrants, because we see that maybe these processes are unfolding gradually and changing the environment in which people live and how they obtain their income, on how their social fabric is organized in a way. So in a way, we might have individuals making the choice, even if constrained, because obviously if there are changes in environment, this choice might not be completely free. But we cannot necessarily talk about forced migration in these cases, but an election of people moving due to environmental causes that in many cases, it's difficult to disentangle this environmental from economic, social, political conflict motivations also for migration. So I think that addressing this and seeing these differences and trying to see where environmental causes are also underlying these processes, it's crucial to safeguard the rights of people who are on the move.
Great reflections there. Thank you so much, Florencia. And indeed, the implication of climate change and the invisible drivers of displacement and the choice that people have to make in the future or even currently. Professor Jenny, from your angle and from your crystal ball as a professor, what does the present and future look like from you?
Well, thank you very much. I think the crystal ball is quite murky at the moment because, as we've heard, the definition of a climate migrant is very vague. There are very many factors involved. So that means we haven't got much data, at least disaggregated data, to identify patterns and trends. So at the moment, the evidence would seem to be that the majority of migration that's climate-induced is within borders. I think it's really useful to think about international migration simply to remind us that we're not going to address any of these issues if we only look within borders. So I suppose the current picture, the data for internal migration is something like one person being displaced per second, or the whole of the Australian population each year. And that is a pattern that's set to rise with increasing population and weather events. So what will the future bring? Well, I think the good news to a degree is that we have some agency. It is in our hands. So it will depend on the success, not just in mitigating climate change, but in our measures that we take collaboratively to adapt and to meet the needs for adaptation, of which migration may be one. So on the one hand, if we collaboratively as a global community build resilience, the dangers of climate displacement will be less. There's an opportunity for people through education and technology and through knowledge transfer to adapt without needing to be displaced. If not, then the loss of livelihoods is going to push people more towards cities, to informal settlements, often in low-lying coastal areas. And in that context, then conflict is a very likely outcome. And when there's conflict, then the international migration scene is more likely to emerge. So I think that the future will depend on collaboration for resilience, or we risk conflict, and conflict that will stabilize the international order as well as creating yet more problems and poverty in local contexts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks, and indeed it's a very mixed bag of outlook in terms of what then looks like. But 2 points there. You talked about, of course, the loss of livelihoods and also the need for collaboration, especially even at a global level, but also at nation states level. And so that then moves me to, of course, the big conversation about loss and damage, the international conversations around climate adaptation, and we've seen, of course, from just recently with the big COP28 that was happening, or COP27 that was happening there in Egypt. So how can high-income countries be held accountable? Because then it brings that discussion. Maybe I just pick off from you, Jenny, and then I come to Florencia, because you already started towards that direction. So how can high-income countries then be held accountable?
Well, I think the short answer is we need a complete paradigm shift. And 3 points, perhaps. Governments, of course, will continue to play an important role, and they need to step up, and they need to step up quickly. And as I was suggesting, we need to step up not just for mitigation, but adaptation and adaptation finance. But adaptation financing can't be delivered by public money alone. So in order to diversify the funding, then governments are going to need to not only have transparent systems of accountability and very clear commitments, but also to reach out to mainstream climate justice. So that will mean not just the business sector, the educational sector, but also civil society. So it seems to me that there we need to think about how collective responsibility in the global north can be nurtured. And I think that their cultural institutions have a really important role. We need to have a historical consciousness. So museums will play an important role. They do play an important role, as does education. People need to be reminded of why the present is as it is because of historical loss and damage from the past. I think that art has a huge role to play. I think we saw that in all the COPs, is that art provides a very different way of making scientific data, much less abstract. People need to feel that they are touched by the realities of climate change. It's hard to imagine elsewhere. It's hard to imagine futures. So art provides a way of bringing, if you like, the imagination and therefore the emotions to bear. And that may mobilize action in terms of finance, but also understanding of responsibilities, which you talked about. So I think there also art and the art sector create different spaces for communities to come together to discover collective agency, not at the government level. And there have been some wonderful examples. One of the Countdown TED collaborations has a South African artist showing how very humble people were making a difference through art installations that feature traditional faith healers, conserving the environment, garbage collectors. So I think there are ways of, if you like, communicating better in order for the global north more collectively to understand their responsibilities and to actually find ways of delivering. And the third point in terms of this paradigm shift is that I think governments need to step up and then need to step back in the global north. We need to enter into partnerships and dialogues, and in those we don't need to, we in the global north, be setting the agenda. We now need to listen. We now need to listen to those who are most impacted. What are their needs? What are their lived realities? And therefore the conversation needs to start from a different end.
Really, really interesting perspective. I must confess, it's the first time that I hear also this, the perspective about the role that art can also play in this kind of conversation when we talk about climate change. So I really appreciate that. Maybe just quickly over to you, Florencia, in terms of high-income countries being held accountable and also in the context of the global south. And the CIPPEC does quite a lot of work around this area. What are your thoughts around this?
Yes, picking up on what Professor Jenny was mentioning, I think, of course, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of climate migration is internal, so in many cases it is within borders that states need to address this phenomenon. I think we also need to enhance international cooperation to make sure that we protect the rights of climate migrants and refugees. So in this context, first of all, I think there are two main points. First, I think it's crucial to embrace a rights-based approach towards migration. So we need to dispel this misconception of relating migration to security issues. We have a lot of evidence already that is available to debunk all the myths that relate migration to security concerns. And I think that in this sense, the Global North has a lot to learn from the Global South, where migration has been conceived as a human right, for example, in Latin America for a long time. So I think that's a really important point that has to be considered. Also in the fact that migration will probably play a pivotal role in discussions and negotiations surrounding climate change. So it's also an important point to raise. And second, the fact that we talk about human mobility should not take to the side the fact that we also need to keep the focus on mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So we have to address a situation of people who are impelled to move, either more or less constrained, but we also need to keep doing efforts to avoid the consequence of climate change if we keep the inaction that we are taking today.
Maybe as a last point here and thought, and I really appreciate that point of also decoupling the whole conversation of migration from security, because in most contexts, migration often, especially forced migration, is looked from a national security or securitized approach. And so maybe as final thoughts, what does a just and equitable global migration architecture look like in the face of climate change? And maybe really to give it, it's a very broad question, but really to give it a face. I know that, for instance, Florencia, the work that you do, you bring in a gender lens. So I'll be very much interested to hear from you. When you talk about just and equitable global migration, what does it look like? And maybe your final closing thoughts before we finish with Professor Jenny here.
I think we need to start building on the international instruments that we have. For example, the Global Compact of Migration that has been approved by many countries a few years ago. It's a really important tool that we have to take into account, because it's the first one that we have that addresses all the different dimensions of migration internationally. So I think that it's a really, and it also has this whole of society approach that also builds in the idea of having this bottom-up approach and involving the different stakeholders that have a say and are related to this phenomenon. So I think that's really important to take it into account, again, from a human rights and also gender-sensitive perspective. I also agree with what Professor Jenny was saying before, that we need more data and we need more evidence, because at this moment in time, we don't know how big the issue it is. And without that information, it's really hard to think about the appropriate policies to address the challenges that we have ahead. And one point that I would also like to mention is that not only we have to talk about human mobility and what human mobility is, but we also have to talk about human immobility in the face of climate change. So when the environment changes and we have these climate change issues that affect the lifestyles of people, many people have the chance or are impelled to move, but many others stay behind. So what are the consequences and what are the drivers of this decision? And how do we ensure the rights of these people as well? So I think we have to address these complexities of this phenomenon, and international cooperation, of course, it's a key issue to address it.
Certainly, certainly. Maybe just quickly over to you, Jenny, briefly. From where you sit, what does just and equitable global migration look like?
Well, I think it has to begin by acknowledging historical responsibilities, which we've talked about, and then building on the instruments we already have available, working towards the status, the legal status that will protect environmental migrants as refugees. I think there is movements in that direction, and that is a legal framework. But I think we need to think of the social and the material infrastructure. We talk about architecture, but we actually need to think about future-proofing the architecture, the urban planning of cities. Wherever people are going to move to, it's likely to be to cities, and they need to be ready for sustainable. And then we need to think about children. So future-proofing education. UNICEF says 70% of current children who are refugees aren't enrolled in the school system, and they need to have their needs serviced. And finally, heritage protection. As people move, even if it is internally, then cultures and languages are lost. We need to be ready to actually find spaces to ensure that languages in the world are not being lost and their unique perspectives with them.
Wow, I think that's a very good, hopeful place to be able then to leave our conversations. Indeed, it's been a very deep reflection. It's also a very complex topic, as you talked about. But just, I mean, what you talked about, the importance of data, the importance of being able to decouple this whole conversation, especially on migration, from a security perspective. And I think what you also talked about, because again, the conversations that are happening are very much at a global level. So that element of the North stepping up, but also stepping back. I know upcoming in September, there is an Africa Climate Summit. So hopefully that will also be an opportunity to hear African voices, especially on this and of course, African solutions. Well, folks, I think that's all the time that we had. Thank you very much for joining us here at live at Kigali in the Kigali Global Dialogue. We very much appreciate the conversations. Thank you very much, Professor Jenny. Thank you very much, Florencia, for joining us today. Thanks.